And we will jump to Wendy's keynote, actually, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Wendy. I don't think Wendy needs an introduction at this point, but in case you don't know who she is, she's senior lecturer currently at London Metropolitan University, interested in how creativity and problem solving are facilitated by the interaction with an uncertain environment and the moment when cognitive agency is distributed across person and objects. She's an experimental cognitive psychologist, which makes her wonderful because she really works at the intersection between sociocultural, I would call them, and cognitive experimental perspectives, developing a theory of accidental cognition, which looks closely at the way in which accidents intrude on our thought processes and when we may be best placed to take advantage of these environmental hints. And she's co-editor of a wonderful upcoming book, which is The Art of Serendipity, and Serendipity Science. So Wendy, share with us, breaking the line, serendipity
Absolutely.
and models.
Here we go. Thank you very much for that, Vlad. Hang on, I'll just unspotlight you. That's the doing everything all at once. And that should be fine. I think everyone should be able to see. Yep. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Vlad. That was a lovely introduction. I think everybody does know who I am by now, and if not, you definitely will do if you're here for the next however many. What is it now? Oh, only 19 hours left actually. But yeah, so I'm co-chair of the Serendipity Society, which is partly why I'm here, and so I am obviously very interested in the study of serendipity. That's why I'm here. But I'm equally a cognitive psychologist, and some of what I'm going to say now is going to be a sharp shift, I've realized, from what's come before. So just bear with me, and we'll go on this ride together. My interest in serendipity arose from my interest in cognition, particularly how we think, and particularly what we call higher order cognitive processes, such as reasoning and problem solving, and how these manifest themselves when we're engagement with the world. Perhaps the highest of these cognitive processes then is creativity, because after all, creative cognition tracks the generation of something from nothing. And so it's what we find when we look at this within the sort of literature is that there's an endless source of fascination. How do we generate these new thoughts? How do we generate creativity? But also of lots of paradoxes and vexing contradictions. And it's my fundamental position that some of these contradictions are not as paradoxical as they first appear, but rather they're caused by an underlying and incredibly misplaced commitment to a sort of methodological individualism that is assuming that the person can be taken on their own without reference to their surrounding environment. This individualism is reflected in the view of human and material relations, which can best be described as hyalomorphic. Hyaluromorphism was coined by Tim Ingold, but it has a long history in various other writers. And it describes the tendency to assume that internal states of creative thinking in the form of mental or neural representations pre-exist the material realization of that thinking. So this is the dominant perspective of the current psychological study of creativity. It sees the creative act as reflecting preconceived, abstract form imposed on inert matter. In other words, we have an idea and then we create. And what we make is directly caused by the thought that we had, the thought that existed prior to any action. And the actions unproblematically and directly reflect that thought. The material form then absorbs that thought. It reflects that thought, and it is completely passive in this whole process. So what this leaves us with then is a line, a direct and uncomplicated line from creative thought to creative product. And do you know what? This line is considered to be so direct and uncomplicated that we can even erase this product and the process of making that product altogether. And in fact, as a psychologist of creative cognition, in theory, my job is to do that, to isolate that mental spark, and from that then understand all creativity. So I'm going to come back to Tim Ingold. This citation comes from the book Making, which has sort of inspired quite a lot of my thinking recently. And he has a description of a line, a straight line, just like this. A straight line drawn between 2 points leaves each point motionless and unfeeling. Such contact may be rational, but it cannot be sentient. And I think this idea of a rational, unidirectional, and hyalomorphic view of creativity is fundamentally misplaced. It stands in contrast to the dynamical logic of inactive perspectives on cognition, which rather view all thought as being co-constituted by environmental engagement. So under this view, a thought cannot be isolated from the way it is manifested. A more transactional perspective on creative thought sees creativity as reflecting not just the intentions and agencies, personalities, skills, potentialities of the creative person, but rather as emerging from engagement with creative material. This is the view I hold, but it's not only one that comes from these sort of philosophical or theoretical perspectives. I think it's the only view that's sustained when we look deeply at the research literature, the qualitative research on creative people. So for instance, Vlad published a paper which had interviews with a broad range of people across different creative domains, artists, designers, writers, and musicians. And what emerged from this series of interviews, when you read it, is this idea of collaborative tension between human and material agency. So the artists interviewed suggest that objects resist the intentions of the artist. All of a sudden, objects ask a question and very often change the original plan. They're breaking that line already. They talk about the objects as being stronger than the creator and imposing their rules. My own work, my own focus, cognitive ethnographies with sculptors and woodworkers, shows again this similar interaction of material and human agent, which only makes sense if we allow them both to be involved in the process. Now, once we grant materials a form of agency, then we also create a space in that creative ecosystem for unintentional accidents. And these again are reported so often in the qualitative literature. In fact, in all the time I've been studying this, I've yet to come across one qualitative research on artistic creativity that does not mention the idea of accidents. So for the artists interviewed by Vlad and colleagues, they said that accidents enrich the project and one needs to be constantly on alert for them. When they interviewed designers, they said creative activity is a game of happy accidents. Scientists, there is in science room for accidents and surprises. Musicians, accidents also play a role in this process, and they are artistically interesting to have. A more recent qualitative study by Keith Sawyer on the creative processes of Masters of Fine Arts students drew out exactly the same key emergent theme in these interviews, that artists described a moment in their creative process when an unexpected accident originating in the external environment contributed to that process. And so this means we can start to move to consider this framework of serendipity. And this will help us to understand the relationship perhaps between accident and artistic skills. Now, what is serendipity? We've already heard a very, very wide range of definitions, and I have no doubt we'll hear a lot more. And that partly reflects the nature of the concept. There's no one, at the moment, no one clear, stable definition of serendipity. But although it's often cast just as this happy accident, more properly, serendipity describes the relationship between an accident and sagacity. So sagacity is this wisdom, this art of meti that I talked about earlier, that's required to navigate and work with an uncertain environment. And so the idea of happiness here is conferred retrospectively. The accident is neutral. The happiness comes in the understanding of the person that experiences it. So it doesn't stem from the accident, but the reaction to that accident, the what follows after the accident. Serendipity only happens when it is recognized as such by the people making the discovery. It's typically then identified in hindsight at the end of a process, and it relies on that person's judgment at that point in time. And I think that's really important when we think about what Monica was presenting earlier about whose serendipity is it? Are there different groups that just can't access serendipity? And for that, we need to realize that serendipity does have this very relational and contingent aspect. What I would call this person's judgment is the sense of serendipity. So the feeling that you have encountered or come across serendipity. Now, while the empirical study of the importance of serendipity in this particular personal and retrospective manner is gaining momentum as a research field, it does mean that you're stuck with a little bit of a problem if you're trying to be in the cognitive psychologist's lab. There's a blurring of a line between serendipity and a sense of serendipity, which renders this whole phenomenon ontologically unstable. And so, despite all the time we hear again and again and again how important serendipity is, most empirical research into serendipity has been inconclusive with regards to the underlying cognitive mechanisms and necessary features. We simply don't know what will make somebody get to the stage where they feel that they have had a serendipitous experience. And additionally, then, serendipity's inherently contingent and subjective nature defies any easy experimental manipulation. So causal conclusions become pretty hard to draw. This means that its impact cannot be reliably explored or enhanced from a systematic perspective. And this leaves us with a bit of a problem. So I've put together this model, which will come out probably sometime next year in a collection of work based on looking at serendipity from a scientific perspective. And I hope that this is a way we can begin a conversation on how we can understand serendipity without needing to rely on the sense of serendipity. And to do this by centering the accident as a triggering cause. If we look at the accident and make that the important part, we can better focus on the reactions to that accident, both individual and systemic, before then moving on to assess long-term impact. It also implies a different form of thinking about processes and phenomena like this. One which I think Ron Baghetto referred to a little bit in his talk at the start about, sorry, I live next to a train line, so I just need to let the train go past. Should have been half an hour earlier and they wouldn't have started. When he talked about we have to rethink our way of looking at some of these processes. What if we are now identifying a necessary pivot event and moving forwards from that event rather than backwards, we shift the traditional direction of research, both in serendipity and creativity. We're not looking at what was serendipitous and what was creative and moving back to try and find the causal events. Instead, we move from hypothesized cause to outcome. I think this will allow us to track uneven trajectories and fully assess the importance of that cause. It's a pretty complex model. You'll have to buy the book if you want to read it all. But I'm going to talk us just through two parts of the model at the moment. The notion of what state might be most suitable for serendipity, and the importance then of the follow-up, the post sort of accident work that we have to do. So it's important, I think, to recognize that really serendipity is a disruptive act, not necessarily a negatively disruptive act, but it is a disruptive act. It breaks and withdraws the line, but takes it beyond a sort of joint agency into something completely new. Serendipity forces noticing and changes the epistemic landscape. So in this model that we have here, and the important thing I think that moves serendipity very much to one of the more radical ideas of how we interact with our environment, is that there's not an omniscient human agent here who's selecting from the environment strategically to scaffold internal processes like we might see in some of the more extended mind theories in this field. Rather, the material world intrudes on those internal processes and derails them. And this interruption forces a noticing, it forces the shock. Toshiki talked about the shock of his artist from seeing that he was studying, from seeing things. That shock and that noticing is integral to an understanding of serendipity. And it comes from this disruption. there is a sort of tricky circularity here, because the accident can be described as the triggering cause, which then serves to set in motion the act of noticing, but it's noticing it that makes it an accident. So we can end up going round and round in circles, and will always be part of the problem, I think. Human and environment are never going to be very easily disentangled. But I propose then, if we look at this prepared mind, we've heard a lot already about the prepared mind today, but if we look at it in relation to the accident, the event that's going to be our trigger bit, our middle bit, then we can explore 3 broad states that we can be in. They're not designed as an exhaustive list, and it's likely that movement will sort of happen across these states. But instead, I sort of want to start a discussion on not what personality you might have or what skills you might need to have underlying, but what state you might be in that's most likely to precipitate serendipity. In this way, to democratize it and take it beyond a focus on the past of the person. So overall, a mind, when it's in interaction with material or a problem, can either be in synchronous flow with that particular problem, with that particular material. And that would be a sort of positive, prepared mind, quite happy, plowing along with life, everything's going fine. It can be frustrated by an elusive capture of material agency. And we've already seen this a couple of times in the idea of creative blocks, in the idea of uncertainty, in the discomfort that you might have. Or it can just be neutral, not really in flow, not really frustrated, just sort of hanging out, vibing, as my children would say. Now, each of these states is necessarily disrupted by the accident. So if you're in flow, that flow will be broken by an accident. If you are frustrated, an accident will relieve that frustration, it will change, it will make things. And if you're neutral, you're no longer neutral. Okay, your attention has been drawn to something. I think this latter neutral state is perhaps the closest to this rather elusive pure serendipity. But I think it's probably the least tangible, and I would suggest the least useful. We're nowhere near understanding something quite so contingent. So as attractive as it is, I suggest we put that to one side for now. The cognitive state that I think is most likely to respond to an accident and view it as a happy one is one in which the prepared mind is frustrated and searching for a form of inspiration, or is already out of sync, already a bit broken. In this case, material agency is almost invited in. You can see it, it's often generated, and we can think about it ourselves by a series of actions, such as fiddling, or unintentional and aimless trials in the scientist's lab, or going for a walk and taking photographs. And both Ben and Toshiki talked about going for a walk as a form of inspiration, as a form of taking yourself out and looking, seeking and searching. And so it's my supposition that this is where you're most open to a serendipitous occurrence. And the state I think we explore here, I have to give all credit to Selena Alfini, who's described it as aching ignorance. In this state, the agent is aware of her shortcomings and is unable to resolve that epistemic abyss through continued cogitation. So she can no longer solve the problem that's in front of her. She's what researchers in creative cognition would term impasse. That is, she's exhausted the search space for all solutions. There's only one place for it to come from. And I think this is the destabilized space that Ron Bagetto talked about this morning in his model. You're not in sync. Now, it might seem odd that I start this talk by talking about materially engaged thinking, and that I have not suggested the most open mental state would be that of being fully engaged with material. I think that it's quite unlikely, and I've developed more over the past 6 months this thinking, that an accident can arise when you're properly in a flow state. I think for it to happen, a flow state would have to be disruptive, and the human agent would become aware of a disconnect between herself and the material world. And when it does happen, I'm going to return to those series of interviews from Vlad, where artists who experience accidents like this, they see it as forcing moments of distance and reflection. So accidents, when you're in this flow state, would need to be extreme enough. They disrupt and they change that state. Otherwise, they wouldn't be noticed. And I think in this sense, it's much more difficult for you to take yourself out of that and to respond to those accidents, and also less necessary. And I'm going to go back again to what Tim Ingold writes about a different form of line that you might have, a sort of responsive line, what I would call an engaged line. And he says it's the line that goes for a walk. It does not represent or prefigure anything. Quite unlike the straight line of Euclidean geometry, it does not connect predetermined points. On paper, it is the trace of a movement rather than a statement of intent. And if you are tracing that movement and following the contours, then this line, which is drawn responsively, may not actually find accident possible. And I'd be interested in exploring this in a much more phenomenological way with creative artists. I also suggest that what happens after the accident is important. So we can see that while all noticed accidents must result in an updated epistemic state, serendipity arises only because we need to have that sedimentation, right? So it only arises when that disruption consciously leads to novelty or discovery through action. Now, that action can be a simple reaction and detour, but it's far more likely to be this selection for action, this inaction of chance. And this is the game-changing element of serendipity. So in other words, the act of noticing and responding to these things extends beyond the simple fact of epistemic change to using this change to direct future action. This work you have to put in to sediment serendipity, to use that accident profitably, is really important. In one of the few examinations of serendipity which contrasts when a similar accident, which moves forward from the accident, resulted in serendipity and when it did not, Barber and Fox note that two different scientists made the accidental observation that an injection of Palpain unexpectedly made rabbits' ears go floppy. One had the time and resources to follow this up and the other did not. One experienced serendipity and the other did not. So serendipitous cognition, as I see it, is deliberately posited as open-ended. We cannot fix beyond the reactions as they continue to go. You can map forwards endlessly. It does not end the story. Instead, a new line is created and drawn. It's my underlying hunch that the nature of the accident is less important than these actions, and also the aimless actions that generate this accident. But without a systematic assessment, that remains a hunch, which is why I think it's important that we undertake this work. Taking into account the relational and entangled nature of the model I've laid out, I further predict that the state of mind prior to the accident will also influence the actions taken. So actions, mind, world, and world will invite certain actions, and round we go in circles. However, underlying all of this is a keen awareness of the contingency of this moment of inaction. What is the difference when the accident happens to what different people do and different actions and work that people put in? So really undergirding all the research that I would like to move on from this is that the best way to understand this flow would be to watch it. Therefore, the best methodological perspective is a prospective one and moving forward. Current methods of creativity move back from the product to find its location in the brain. Now, serendipity represents a disruption, a dissolution of these boundaries and a breaking of the line, which means we cannot trace back because we won't be able to get back to the brain. Recognizing that these moments exist and working towards identifying them adds to the complexity of understanding this intangible moment. I'm going to leave again with some words from Ingold, which he's written to reflect how making happens. But I think it's how we need to be able to think about research in these idiosyncratic fields of creativity and serendipity. And he writes, this is a matter not of predetermining the final form of things and all the steps needed to get there, but of opening up a path and improvising a passage. To foresee, in this sense, is to see into the future, not to project a future state of affairs in the present. It is to look where you are going, not to fix an endpoint. Such foresight is about prophecy, not prediction. And it is precisely what enables practitioners to carry on. And there's a few people that I need to thank for all their time and effort helping me think through these thoughts. And obviously Vlad, who's on there anyway, for inviting me to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy. That was fantastic. I'm going to give you a round of applause as well. It's very symbolic. Morning came in just through your talk. I feel like I started, in the darkness, and now it's all light. Excellent. Thank you so much. Sadly we have only 4 minutes to unpack your amazing talk. I mean, I personally, I resonate with everything you said. It really strikes me that you have a very pragmatist approach in many ways when you talk about this tense state and this kind of conflict and tension we're working through. And what strikes me also is the fact that we talk about creativity, we talk about serendipity, and for many people from the outside, these seem to be like very contained, narrow fields in some ways. People sometimes box you into, okay, so you're doing psychology of creativity, and that's what you do. But when you get into these topics, it's a whole philosophy and a whole world and a whole kind of, it forces you to rethink what it means to be human in many ways, and what it means to do research. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy about your talk, and I'm hoping we will continue to pick up on this theme through the day. So let me see if anyone has a quick question for Wendy. Probably we have time for one question or a comment. Can also be in the chat. Otherwise, I can very easily fill these 3 minutes, but trying to be a bit patient.
Can I just ask Wendy? It was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Especially from an experimental psychologist and cognitive psychologist, it's a great complementary relationship with the kind of qualitative work that quite often we do in creativity research. And my question would be a very brief question. Is I'm not sure if I understand the concept of flow the way you do. And so following from Csikszentmihalyi, I would see the state of flow as not necessarily a happy, as a fluid experience, but also quite often challenging and painful and risky. And so I could imagine that anticipation that you described so wonderfully, not anticipation, but aching and yearning or disruption as the beginning of that flow experience that I understand from Csikszentmihalyi. So for me, flow might actually follow the disruption, not necessarily has has to precede and be disrupted, if that makes sense. So I just would like to ask if you have any comments on this to actually better understand what we understand as flow.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. I think that being in that sort of accidents will force you to reorient yourself towards whatever that material might be that you're using to create, and from that develop a new understanding that can improve the relations with that. I use materials really, really broadly because for me a material can be sub-vocalizing right underneath, right? Anything that is not mental, but something that's out there in the world. So when I use it here, I know it's not really material, but I'm using it more broadly. So yes, so an accident will come in and push you back into that sort of state of connection with the world. I think that's probably quite likely.
I think here and sadly again we don't have time, but we have 1 minute and then many things can be accomplished. I think here we go back to what you said, Wendy, as well about immersion and detachment, which is one of my obsessions as well in many ways, and it's a dichotomy that is very interesting because we cannot fully separate them very neatly perhaps, and there is some detachment in flow, and there is some immersion in the way we wonder, for instance, but yeah, for me as well, flow is very much the immersion, being immersed, and immersion is a state of less differentiation perhaps, and detachment allows you more differentiation. So there are many benefits that come with differentiation. There are many benefits that come with immersion as well, I would say. Bem also has a comment or question. I have to end with Bem's question. I cannot simply move on. Do you think there is a special state around learning to notice more, expanding awareness of the world? Here you can talk about possibility thinking. My God, I'm
yeah. We'll tell you now. I think until we stop using stories that come only from people who'd experienced serendipity, I think it'll be very hard for us to know, because until we put people in the same situation and see whether different people respond to it differently, then we're not going to know it'd be impossible to disentangle what skills there are, or whether those skills are just about that you have an increased sense of serendipity. So if we think about the work that Maggie did really early on, where different people are more inclined to see patterns, right? Or people are more inclined to see practicality. That doesn't mean there's more patterns there or more practicality there. So somehow we've got to start disentangling that. And I think we can't do that the current way we look at it, which is we take an experience of serendipity and then we look at, and then we pull back from that, well, that must have caused it. Instead, we need to say, okay, so here's the cause. What are the things that, here's this triggering cause here. What are the things that then move on from there? And that's why I think it requires a real rethinking of how we look at it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy. And do direct your questions and comments to Wendy. I'm sure
I'm here all day.
Sorry, yes, you're here all day. They know where to find you. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to have yet again the reminder that I'm